Hey everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives about some of the most urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Princeton senior Tiger Gao. Today, joining me remotely is the very famous Dave Wasserman. He is the House editor for the Cook Political Report, a nonpartisan polling and election forecasting group. Before joining that, he worked as the House editor for another widely respected polling and elections forecasting firm, Sabato's Crystal Ball. At the Cook Political Report, Dave is known for one of the nation's most prominent and recognized election forecasters. He successfully forecasted the 2016 and 2018 elections, accurately suggesting that Donald Trump may win the presidency while losing the popular vote. He is actively involved in examining House races using individual districts to key in on larger electoral trends, and he collaborates with FiveThirtyEight to produce the groundbreaking Atlas of Redistricting, which models redistricting and gerrymandering scenarios for all 50 states. It's a very long bio because I really want our listeners to understand how big of a deal Dave actually is, both in the political media community and also especially in the past few months as the nation's eyes were all focused on the 2020 election season. So Dave, thank you so much for joining Neil and I today. Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thanks for all of the the fluff in the introduction.
And hosting the interview with me is my friend Neil Reddy, who is a freshman on our team, but incredibly knowledgeable in elections and politics. So Neil, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Tiger. All right, so to start us off, a little bit of a personal question. For our listeners, David is actually a native of Montgomery, New Jersey, which is just about 6 miles north of Princeton. So on that note, can you kind of walk us through your path from growing up in New Jersey into reporting on politics and becoming a forecaster in elections?
Yeah, I love this question because I never get to talk about this, but now with my Princeton audience, I can share my backstory. Um, Actually, my parents both taught at Rutgers, so we were not exactly Ivy League, but I did grow up closer to Princeton, and my love of geography actually came before my love of politics. When I was in elementary school, I I loved drawing maps, and anytime I saw a map anywhere, I was just drawn to it. And I remember actually in first grade, uh, I had this habit of drawing street maps of our neighborhood, and I handed them out to my teachers because this was before Google Maps and everything, and I figured they need a way to find out their way around. And so uh, years later, I was just curious what had happened to my first grade teacher. This was like maybe a year and a half ago. I reached out to Mrs. Barkley, and I remember she was one of my favorite teachers, but I hadn't spoken to her in I don't know, like 30 years or so. And so I found her. I tracked her down on Facebook, and I just said, Mrs. Barkley, thank you. I just want to say thank you for encouraging my love of maps. You know, you were the teacher who always thought it was cool, and I waited a couple days, no reply. I figure, okay, well maybe she's not on social media that much. But then 4 or 5 days later, I get this message back, and there's no text. It's just a photo, and it's of the map that I had handed her 30 years ago, and she had kept it for all of these years, and I was just totally blown away. So I had good and encouraging teachers, but I started getting curious about politics probably um, in sixth grade. There was this congressional race in New Jersey's 12th district where the Republican incumbent at the time, Mike Pappas, had sung a song on the wall of the House, to attack Bill Clinton during the impeachment. And then there was this Princeton plasma physics physicist named Rush Holt who was running against him. And this guy was kind of a magoo. He was a very awkward politician, but there was something endearing about him to a lot of voters. And it was fascinating to be in this district and to see this race up close. And it was one of the biggest upsets of the 1998 election cycle. And I think it was the one race that year that the Cook Political Report had down as likely Republican that actually went to the Democrats. And so that kind of sparked an interest in forecasting for me. And I remember I would go to the library and sit in the library for a couple hours at a time and read the Almanac of American Politics because you couldn't check it out of the reference section. And I just wanted to know who these people were and what made them tick. And for my next birthday, I asked my parents for a subscription to the Cook Political Report because I had seen Charlie Cook and Amy Walter on C-SPAN talking about election forecasting, and then they looked up how much it was a year, and they refused and got me a subscription to Governing Magazine instead, which I found pretty boring. So I like to think I have the last laugh by having written about races for the Cook Report for the last 13 years or so.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. I mean, she knew your teacher knew that you were going to be famous, so she kept all the map for all those years. She knew you would play such a pivotal role in today's election forecasting community, probably.
Well, or I like to think she just needed the map.
Yeah. So maybe we can start with the most basic question, Dave, because you were talking about you getting involved with Cook Political Report. What is election forecasting? That's just a very general, basic question. We all read things. We read the numbers. We hear those sites like FiveThirtyEight, Cook Political Report, Crystal Ball. How does this actually work? Like, how do you and your team collect data and work together? Do you use mathematical models or statistical algorithms? What is the inner workings like to actually do election forecasting?
Well, it's an awesome question, and to be upfront, our forecast did not do a great job of predicting what would happen in the House elections in 2020, and this wouldn't be an interesting field if there weren't surprises from time to time. I'm not discouraged anytime that we're wrong, so much as I am motivated to try and see if we can do better the next time around. But my philosophy on forecasting is a hybrid approach. I think we are at a crossroads in political journalism and forecasting between the quantitative and the qualitative side of things. For years and years, there was a more qualitative emphasis on covering elections. And outlets like the Cook Report and the Rothenberg Report and Sabato's Crystal Ball and others who are kind of in the CNN inside politics space, they were looking at candidate quality and kind of the nuances of media strategy and ads more than they were looking at spreadsheets. And then you had this gradual switch in the last decade where outlets such as FiveThirtyEight and Nate Silver and The Upshot and others really hit the jackpot. And there was a real appetite and hunger for an algorithmic approach to analyzing politics. My philosophy is that if you're only staring at spreadsheets and building models based on data, but not talking to the candidates or the consultants involved in these races, you're missing half the picture, because there are aspects of elections that are unquantifiable, but are still important for understanding the dynamics of an election. But if you're only talking to the candidates and playing, the parlor game of taking your sources out to the Capitol Grill, and you're not looking at the long-term trends in the data, then I think you're also missing half the picture. So I've tried my best to blend those two disciplines, and I think we've been ahead of the curve more often than we've been behind it.
I guess just to quickly follow up on that, what kind of data or indicators do you collect? Because a lot of people would say the polling data are often very inaccurate, and therefore, because a lot of people don't answer the phone calls, or maybe the common meme is like the suburban housewives are very enthusiastically liberal, whereas the conservatives never answer the phone calls. So a lot of people say the model seems to be garbage in, garbage out. You just have a lot of data, but you can forecast all you want, but it's just really not what's actually how people feel.
Yeah, and so what actually goes into the cauldron of our forecasts is at the start of every election cycle, the most important data point is what happened in the last election. And then what I try and do is evaluate, okay, how has the national mood changed? How have different demographic groups moved since the last election? And that might give you a pretty good approximation of how a district has shifted since the last election. Now, I think the big pitfall in 2020 was as you get closer to the election, we're more reliant on district level polls and a lot of the polling that is not released but is used by the parties to make spending allocation decisions on races. Well, it turns out that the more we based our forecast on those polls close to the election, and the more we moved away from the fundamentals, such as uh, the assumption that Trump would bring more of his voters back into the electorate, which was, I think, a pretty dominant theme of ours throughout 2019, or that, or just that the fundamental lean of districts in the last presidential election would be a good guide to this one. The more we got away from that, I think the less accurate our forecast became. One of the confounding things about 2020 was that the party's polls internally were pretty much in agreement. I think they were actually in closer alignment than they had been in 2016 or 2018. There was just a systemic, bias towards Democrats in the response rate, and of course, this is going to take years to unpack. It's possible that this differential response could get worse. One theory I don't buy is that there are large numbers of Trump voters who are actively misleading pollsters or refusing to tell pollsters that they support Trump or Republicans. I think it's more a case of Trump spent the last 5 years bashing the entire polling industry entirely. And so naturally, his supporters are a bit more hostile to pollsters or taking a survey. I think that is part of it. And, COVID and the changing makeup of the parties in this knowledge economy versus service economy is a part of it as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way of explaining kind of what happened. And there's kind of been a polling consensus about that, but I think something that's a little interesting is the different ways that people have gone about explaining what happened in this past election. And I think one of the guests we had a couple of weeks ago was Robert Barnes, who is a elections bettor and a lawyer, and he won a significant amount of money betting on the 2016 presidential election, kind of using the idea that primary enthusiasm would lead to a result, and using that as a predictor. And also, you might be familiar with Helmut Northputh of Stony Brook, who predicted that Trump would win in a landslide. Obviously, that was not correct, but he uses primary data as well. So what's your take on using primary enthusiasm to kind of guide your predictions, and do you think that matters at all?
I'm not a close follower of Mr. Barnes's work. I know that there have been times when he's attacked me and others who are in this field on social media, but I have not seen him make a successful bet on Democrats yet. I'm pretty sure that he was adamant that Republicans would hold on to control of the House in 2018, and so I think it's kind of a broken clock situation with him. I have no doubt that there are people who have made plenty of money betting on politics. That's something that's kind of a realm I'll never get into because I see it as a conflict of interest.
I see, because I think the way he thinks about things is through very unconventional data, which is like voter registration trends, division within political parties, measured by how many candidates are participating in the primary elections, or at what Neil was saying about the enthusiasm for primaries, and even things like he was talking about the Vikings descendants in Michigan would really like Trump because that's the kind of personality they want to interact with, so something like that. So it seems that there's a faction of people like him, or forecasters, who use very unconventional data sets or alternative data sets because they would say, they're essentially saying that the conventional polling data are not the right way to look at how forecasts should be done. Do you see this challenge, or?
I would maybe take a slightly different line on that. I don't think it's unconventional to look at voter registration trends. I for one wrote a story about how they seemed pretty positive for Trump back in I think early September, when we were looking at the voter registration data in Florida and Pennsylvania and North Carolina. It was apparent that Republicans' commitment to knocking on doors and a ground game even during the pandemic was paying dividends when it came to registering voters. Um, I don't think it's all that unconventional to look at primary performance. Uh, one of the best pieces, I think, one of the most prescient pieces on 2020 was written by my colleague Sean Trendy at Real Clear Politics, who took a look at the primary result in Washington State, which has a top 2 primary, and said, you know what, there's something interesting happening here. In 2018, the primary result was indicative of what would happen in November. It foreshadowed a Democratic wave, but this time the primary turnout is more Republican than it was in 2018. And maybe that's a sign that Democrats won't do so well down ballot this time. You know, in retrospect, I think there were some signs that we missed at the Cook Political Report, and one was that Trump was actually the best thing going for down ballot Republicans in two respects. The first is that he, in some ways, liberated a number of soft Republican voters to split their tickets, because his presence at the top of the ticket meant that those voters could directly vote against Trump if they disliked Trump, but continue to vote for more conventional Republicans as a check on Biden or Democrats going too far. That was not an option that was available to those voters in 2018. And I think that dynamic did take hold very late in the 2020 cycle, when it became more apparent that Biden was the favorite. The second is that Trump simply drives millions of low propensity conservatives to the polls. People who would never vote or show up for, your average Joe congressional Republican candidate in a midterm or off-year election. And that's exactly the reason why Kevin McCarthy went down to Palm Beach and is actively courting Trump to be engaged in the 2022 elections and beyond, because Republicans did reap the benefits of Trump being on the ballot and driving out people who, frankly, dislike both political party establishments, but dislike Democrats more. So those are, I think, probably the basic dynamics that drove this election. I do not believe in trying to make sense of social media engagement as a means of predicting elections, but those other data points like voter registration and ticket splitting are important.
And kind of just going off of the ticket splitting idea, I guess we're seeing a lot of Republicans who were beneficiaries of that double down on being Trump, full Trump, full MAGA. I think some of the Republicans who actually are in districts that voted for Biden voted to not certify the results of certain states. Just like off of that idea, do you think that this sort of Trump enthusiasm from these Republicans is an effort to kind of get those voters to be regular Republicans, like even in midterm elections, like those low propensity voters that you were mentioning?
Yeah, there was less of a divide between the swing district Republicans and the really red district Republicans than I might have expected on the objection to certification votes. You did see some Republicans from very swingy districts vote to object, and Mike Garcia from California was kind of a notable person who voted against impeachment, voted to object. It's hard to say what their fortunes are going to be in 2022 without knowing what the lines look like, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I do think there's more political incentive than there used to be to play to the base.
I think you mentioned in a recent article that there aren't as many, it isn't as big of a dominance as it was in 2010 10 for Republicans, but it's still going to be, it still might be a huge loss there for Democrats, and just on redistricting alone. Could you kind of go into what you're sensing from like the redistricting commissions across the country? And
Yeah, Democrats got clobbered in the last round of redistricting. And part of the reason was that Republicans had a great year in 2010. It was the first Obama midterm. And so they took over a bunch of state legislatures, a bunch of governorships, and that paid off for the next 10 years. Now, it wasn't completely bulletproof because Democrats did take back the House in 2018. But one thing to note is that had it not been for Democratic lawsuits in a number of states, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, that overturned the Republican drawn boundaries in the middle of the decade, then Democrats would not be in the majority today in the House. That easily netted Democrats more than 6 seats. So uh, this is a hugely consequential process, and even tiny changes to boundaries could tip control of the House in 2022. I think there are a couple of things that make this cycle quite different from 10 years ago. And the first is that Republicans are less dominant than they were then, just in terms of raw power and in preparedness. Republicans lost governorships in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. There's a new commission in Michigan anyway. And Democrats now have a full control of New York and New Mexico and Oregon. And so, Republicans still on balance have the authority to redraw 188 districts to Democrats 73, but that's not as big a gap as the 219 to 44 gap that existed back in 2011. Second of all, there are more redistricting commissions in place than there were 10 years ago. And there are potentially robust commissions in place in Michigan and Colorado and Virginia. There are less robust reforms in place in Ohio, New York, and Utah, where the legislature could potentially overrule what the commission does. And a lot of people are saying that these commissions in those 3 states were set up to fail. The evidence so far suggests that's the case, but we'll see. Then third of all, this topic has just exploded in public consciousness in the last decade, mostly on the left as a reaction to Republicans building supermajorities out of a lot of states through favorable boundaries. There is a lot of misunderstanding, I think, about this issue. It's a myth that the technology to gerrymander has gotten a lot better. I think the technology to draw lines has basically been the same in the last 30 years. It's just the software and the processing speeds are a bit faster, but that's about it. What's really changed is that America is more geographically polarized than it was, and I have my metric on Whole Foods and Cracker Barrel and all of that. And but just to put it in simple terms, back in 1992, 38% of American voters lived in landslide counties, or counties that voted for one party's presidential nominee by more than 20 points. In 2020, that number was 58% of Americans who lived in landslide counties. And the county boundaries didn't change. This was simply a self-sorting of the electorate. And so when that's the case, it's easier than ever for partisan map makers to draw the lines in a way that packs the other side's voters, or draws fences around them and tries to maximize the advantage for their own party. And then finally, I think a big difference between this time and 10 years ago is that Democrats are better prepared financially. They're better prepared to sue in more places. I think Democrats will probably outspend Republicans 2-1 on redistricting, and that's mostly going to be spent in court. So there is more potential for courts to take over the process in certain states. That could maybe reduced gerrymandering a little bit, particularly because the census data is late this time because of COVID, and there's less of a time frame for legislatures to complete the process. That probably heightens the chance that you'll see judges take over the process from legislatures.
Dave, there's so many ideas to unpack. We talked about redistricting, and you also mentioned the Whole Foods Cracker Barrel example. I do want to go into about demographic shifts a little bit, especially what we witnessed in the 2020 election, because you pointed out that Joe Biden won 85% of counties with Whole Foods and 32% of counties with the Cracker Barrel. So, which is the widest discrepancy between those two constituency ever. And would you mind telling us a little bit more about that analysis, what that means for the cultural polarization and races going forward? It's quite fascinating.
So I was inspired back in 2011 to do a research study on which retail chains, were the best predictors of where Democrats and Republicans live and vote. And I came upon those two. And back in 1992, using today's locations, Bill Clinton won 59% of the counties that today have a Whole Foods Market and 40% of the counties that today have a Cracker Barrel. That was a 19-point gap. And that gap has gone up in every single election until 2020, when, as you stated, the gap was 53 points. So about 3 times the size of the gap that existed in 1992. And it's really just a proxy for the parties changing coalitions, but Democrats are more reliant than ever on college graduates who cluster in high income urban areas and suburbs and college towns, and Republicans are more reliant than ever on blue collar voters. And by the way, we saw in 2020 that that the Hispanic vote in America is beginning to behave more like the blue collar white vote than it used to. Of course, it's still a long way away from that, but but the gap is shrinking between those two groups. And so 2020, a lot of people thought, well, Joe Biden, he's the patron saint of blue collar Democrats. If anyone can bring Democrats back in Cracker Barrel country, it's Joe Biden. I never thought that was all that realistic. And, I thought, yes, he can recover some, but the surge for Democrats is going to be more in Whole Foods territory. And sure enough, 85% of Whole Foods counties. And so we don't see that trend abating. The real danger I see for Democrats moving forward is that I'm not sure a candidate other than Joe Biden could have performed that well in Cracker Barrel country and won 32% of Cracker Barrel counties. I don't think Kamala Harris could have, for example. So I do not count Trump out as a candidate in 2024 if he chooses to run.
So can we say that Trump's base, or the Cracker Barrel voters, have been permanently activated, that the MAGA voters or the working class blue collar workers from the Midwest, and their political enthusiasm often will be directly directed to someone more from the right wing conservative base rather than someone of this Joe Biden type of appeal, because now it seems that Democratic Party faces a reckoning, which is, are you going to try to stick with someone like Joe Biden style, Sherrod Brown style, which is fiscally liberal or socially liberal but fiscally conservative, or in some other ways appealing to the Midwest voters, or do you want someone that's like AOC, Bernie Sanders style, that is, they're going to call us socialists anyway, so we're just going to go shift that way anyways? So don't you see that as emblematic of this internal split between the Democratic Party as well?
Yeah, look, there are obviously divisions in both parties, but this widening gap between the parties. Well, first of all, I don't think there are any permanent trends in politics. If Republicans 4 or 8 years from now were to nominate Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz, I don't think they could replicate the Trump coalition exactly. I think it would look quite different. But I do think that the party's growing cultural divide, this Whole Foods Cracker Barrel, or however you want to put it, divide, it's like a freight train. I don't think there is anything that's on the cusp of reversing it or slowing it down. And yet, um, you know, Republicans are in this odd situation where congressional Republicans need Trump to drive turnout. And Trump has never really had much use for the Republicans in Congress except as a vehicle for, passing an agenda to the extent he did, and and for giving him a ballot line on each state's ballot. Beyond that, I don't think Trump sees himself really as a Republican, and that's been advantageous for disaffected independents. On the Democratic side, for all of the talk about Democrats moving left in 2018, and certainly the most high profile victories that year were by people like AOC and the Squad, the reality is that Democrats continue to suck up more of the moderate business community. That's really been their growth demographic in the past 4 years. And in fact, one of the reasons Joe Biden was really underestimated, especially when he came in fourth and fifth place in Iowa and New Hampshire, was that fundamentally the real base of the Democratic Party had not voted yet, and the base of the Democratic Party fundamentally is African American voters and suburban professional women, which, by the way, are not mutually exclusive groups, but that was essentially the Biden coalition, and that I think is the future of the Democratic Party.
And to kind of shift that to like a more macro level, I think we've seen some states like Virginia and Colorado kind of swiftly move from at one point swing states to now likely Democratic, and maybe that's because of the college educated suburbanites in those states, but also just diversifying populations. And so like on the other hand, we've seen like states like South Dakota, which once had 2 Democratic senators, completely move away from Democrats altogether, and in Florida and Ohio to an extent. So do you see these as like permanent trends, like you said, or are these demographic shifts among states, or is it like dependent on candidates or policy? What do you see explaining these different trends going on across the country geographically?
So I think clearly Georgia is moving in a Virginia type of direction, and Arizona is moving in a Colorado type of direction. I think they're just a few years behind, but what explains why those states are moving in Democrats' direction, but not necessarily North Carolina or Texas? Well, in the case of Texas, there's a large Hispanic vote that is not metro. That, as we saw in 2020, moved away from Democrats in a big way and offset the suburban major metro gains that Democrats were making. What's different about North Carolina? It's actually not that urban a state. The Atlanta metro area makes up more than half of Georgia's votes. You put the Charlotte and Research Triangle metro areas together, and they don't make up much more than 40% of North Carolina's vote. So that's a pretty big difference demographically between those two states. And North Carolina really is more small town and rural than commonly thought. So, I don't see a Democratic path to victory in the Electoral College in the future that does not run through Georgia, to be frank with you. I think we're continuing to see Democrats stagnate in the upper Midwest. Yes, they lost Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin by a fraction of a point in 2016, and they won it by a point or a fraction of a point in 2020. But fundamentally, those states are pretty stagnant for Democrats relative to what we're seeing in the Sun Belt. So it's a close trade-off. And unless Texas were to really continue to move towards Democrats in a big way, then this will continue to be a very close fight in the Electoral College.
So to kind of like summarize what you're saying and move into a little bit of a different direction, do you think the country's electoral shifts are kind of evening out the playing field? Like you've seen some Sunbelt states that were previously red states kind of become ambiguous, purple maybe. And then you've seen states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, which were once pretty strong Democratic states, kind of shift back to the median. So is there like an evening out going on because of this really strong polarization on the micro level? Or is it just a big blue shift that Democrats like AOC think is happening, and that we just need to turn out more progressive voters, and we'll win all these elections? Is there a right answer there, or is it just dependent on the candidate? What are your thoughts on this idea of like shifting political ideology like on a national scale?
I'm not sure I fully grasped the first option that you put forward, but since I kind of doubt the second option, I'll go with the first one. I think it's less of a regional divide and more of how urban is your state versus how rural is your state divide. And Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania are less urban states than Georgia. They're certainly less urban states than Arizona, which is 81% urban suburban, doesn't have many rural voters to speak of. And yeah, this lifestyle divide marches on. And so does the information ecosystem divide. And that's a whole nother podcast on how the lines between media and punditry and reporting and opinion have blurred.
Dave, could we actually talk a little bit more about the punditry as this phrase that you talked about? Because a lot of people came out of the 2020 election cycle being quite disappointed at the quote unquote Beltway media, which refers to the Washington, D.C. Beltway, the legacy media platforms. They think that not only do those media outlets and journalists do not really understand what most Americans are thinking, they're also just producing content that is trying to be as polarizing as possible. And so a lot of times they would look at someone like Nate Silver's forecast and say, if you put Trump's winning odds at Biden's winning odds at 90%, and it ends up being a somewhat close race, what are you talking about? There was no blue wave. And that's why people were disappointed. They think there's a fundamental disconnect, whether it's cognitively or politically, from those who are doing the reporting and those who are actually the vast majority of Americans.
Yeah, well, I think there's a real lack of self-awareness on the part of a lot of DC journalists, just about how geographically concentrated the media landscape has become. As we've seen a hollowing out of state capital bureaus and local newsrooms, and a concentration of news media in DC and in the big coastal cities. It's certainly made it less likely that your median voter personally knows a journalist, or personally, went to school with someone who's relaying the news to them, and trust is built that way. And so I think that explains why there's such a trust deficit right now. For all of the mystique about Nate Silver and his models, in my experience collaborating with FiveThirtyEight, he's probably the most normal guy there. I don't say that like to denigrate the other people who work at FiveThirtyEight, but honestly, he's a great hang. And he comes from Lansing, Michigan. He grew up there and kind of culturally understands parts of the country that a lot of New York Times reporters might not, from personal experience. And I actually think that has served him well when it comes to not foreclosing possibilities that other pundits and data cruncher types might not think are possible.
So by saying that, do you mean that most of his team are way too technical, where they're just simply come from a certain intellectual bubble from colleges that are very liberal? Or therefore disconnected from a lot of people. What did you exactly mean by the nature of a lot of those organizations?
Or just that there could be a selective bias in someone's interpretation of polling because they've only been surrounded by people who might think a certain way for most of their lives. I think that that's a real bias, and at times I've probably been guilty of that myself. But one thing people might not know about me is that during normal times, I travel to 30 states a year. I'm mostly giving briefings to different trade and industry groups about what's happening in elections. But I always try and stick around for a lot of the business sessions to see what the what people in these states are thinking about the regulatory environment or the issues that are confronting their industry, because it does offer a much different perspective on politics from what you see tuning into cable news. Look, like I could tune in to CNN or MSNBC and think about Marjorie Taylor Greene all day. I just have better things to do with my time than that. And there are actual issues that voters are thinking about that matter to their lives that are not talked about on cable news.
Dave, I guess this kind of touches on a little bit more a fundamental philosophy of your way of looking at the world and doing election forecasting, because Nate Silver is very famous for being known as a Bayesian. And for our listeners, Bayesian means that you go in with some kind of prior, and then you update your beliefs based on all the data you see, and then you eventually arrive at what they call a posterior kind of result. And it's quite frequently used in econometrics or statistics, and he basically brought that into election forecasting. I don't know too much about you. Do you would you consider yourself a Bayesian? Do you use a certain kind of model? Your way of looking at the world, how would you characterize as the biggest differences between you and all the other election forecasters in terms of your philosophy?
I'm going to be brutally honest with you. I took one stats class in college and got a B minus. I don't have any formal statistical training whatsoever. I've studied politics and elections for most of my life in the case study context, and I've tried to. I mean, I'm not completely devoid of skills. I taught myself Excel at an early age, and I have a giant spreadsheet with every congressional district and county and their relevant census data and political trend data and all that. But no, I think there can be a tendency to over
glorify the money ball kind of thinking of.
Look, I think it's much more important to get a feel for history and the relationship between different areas of a state and demographic groups, and that's what serves me well on election night when I'm trying to figure out who's going to win. Because if you can be confident in what's happened in the trends from the past, I think that can help you more than an individual model.
But just a quick follow up on that, there seems just to be so many facts and statistics and trends and data, right? So some people say within this state, there's been, those competing forces, therefore this candidate would win. And in this state or in that area, there's been that kind of historical forces or cultural forces that's driving this. So I completely agree with your qualitative combined with quantitative approach of looking at the world, but it just seems to me to be very, very difficult, right? To combine the historical, cultural, political analysis, because there just seems to be so much information and interpretations.
Yeah, and the other thing about it is if you're building a model that's based on historical data, and I think this is kind of the flaw in what G. Elliott Morris and some others have done. And you've tried to, or an economic model of presidential elections. There are plenty of professors who have their models on that basis. But we're in a much different political era than 10 or 20 or 30, certainly 50 years ago. Those cases might not be relevant in this context of hyper polarization and and an era of kind of closed information loops and so forth. So you've got to be able to reinvent how you're going about this from election to election, because politics is constantly reinventing itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I kind of want to get into one of these qualitative ideas you use a lot, which is like candidate quality in terms of these, especially these Senate races. And I think you can kind of see that with the runoffs we had in Georgia, especially, where we kind of had two Republican candidates that were not very impressive, and on the other hand, we had Democratic candidates who are political novices, but actually were quite energetic in getting the base out. So what was your interpretation of candidate quality there, and how it might have played a role in foreseeing what had happened in Georgia and maybe even in future elections? Because that's always been a thing that Cook Political Report, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, the importance of candidate quality has gone down an awful lot, just in the past couple decades, and I don't think we can point to the Georgia Senate result necessarily as a reflection of candidate quality. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about John Ossoff being a poor fit for Georgia's 6th district in the 2017 special election. I mean, the guy didn't live in the district. He seemed like an activist who didn't have much of a resume for Congress, and Democrat and voters in that district were probably looking for someone who was more of an authentic member of the community and a bit more moderate. I do think a majority of the Democratic wins in Georgia are attributable to Trump not being on the ballot in the runoffs, and Democrats had extraordinarily high intensity on their side that kept through January, whereas Republicans saw a slightly bigger drop off, and I think that was more of a factor. But candidate quality can certainly, matter in a negative way, and I think Loeffler was a bit of a one note candidate in her approach to trying to define Raphael Warnock. She also was easy to turn into a villain to a lot of people, particularly in the Atlanta suburbs, even though she was supposedly going to save the Republican Party in northern Atlanta. And there's no doubt that Warnock ran a really smart ad with the Beagle. It was a really effective ad that preempted the line of attack that Loeffler laid out, and it wasn't even his dog.
Yeah, and I think using those sort of traditional ways of getting voters out actually kind of was a bit of a shift in narrative towards the decade worth of spreadsheet crunching we've had from lots of elections people. And kind of going forward, we've got a bunch of open seats in 2022, and I guess kind of a blank slate for both parties in some sense. So in terms of putting out competitive candidates for all these races, what do you think are like the biggest qualitative factors that need to be done in terms of advertising and turnout, and maybe just also going back to candidate quality a little bit, and like what groups are the most important in terms of getting voters out, and what demographic groups what you think will play the biggest role in defining the results of the midterms in 2022?
So, first and foremost, I think, clearly the president's approval rating 2 years in is going to be be a very big driver of what happens in a midterm election. There are some reasons to think this midterm is going to be quite different from Obama's first term midterm. One big reason is that Democrats have very tiny majorities, both in the presidential race and in Congress, and there's probably less ability for Democrats to legislate to the left. They're not going to be passing sweeping legislation like the ACA that generated the kind of backlash and ads that propelled Republicans in 2010. At the same time, Trump was also an important Democratic driver of turnout, and the fact he's no longer in office kind of calls into question how active the Democratic electorate will be. But Trump was also very effective in communicating with voters on the margins of political engagement. And as we saw in 2018, the electorate did get more college educated in a midterm. And so that dynamic is a bit different from what we saw during the Obama years. Just that, there's been a pro-democratic shift in the highest turnout strata, if that makes sense. And that might offset some or mitigate some of the typical backlash against a first-term president in their midterm. So I think it's going to be highly competitive for both the House and Senate. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Republicans are going to take back the House. But when you add up the tally of who has control from state to state and redistricting, I do think the House starts out as a toss-up before you even get to the political environment and the candidate quality.
Dave, I wanted to ask you a very broad question, I guess, about two competing narratives that I've heard, one pro-Democrat, one pro-Republican. I know we don't have too much time left, so it's probably a broad question. The pro-Republican argument is that there's a very pessimistic outlook for the Democratic Party because Biden would not be able to legislate too much. He will be seen as somewhat of a lame duck president because he's one term. The majority is not that big. So he won't be able to do too much. The Trump/MAGA wing will continue to slam him. They'll continue to drive the nation further. And what will happen is that the Republicans will have a big landslide in 2022. And in 2024, Kamala Harris could easily be wiped out by someone like Josh Hawley or like a populist right wing who can reignite the MAGA base. So that's the pro-Republican narrative that I've heard. The pro-Democrat argument is that look at what happened in the Capitol riots. That's horrible. And the Republican Party has no choice but to abandon Trump right now. And they have to, the Republican Party is basically in a split between do they want to save Trump's base or do they actually want to recorrect the course to go back to the bread and butter, Bush, McCain kind of republicanism. And then right now, it's also the perfect time for the Democratic Party to strike. So we see Nancy Pelosi taking the initiative in the impeachment trial, and that will end a lot of the chances for Trump and his associates, their chances in 2022 and 2024. So both seem to be predominating narratives in today's discourse. Do you like either of them? Do you see one as being more possible than the other?
Well, I think the second narrative is a very DC bubble fallacy. The notion that there's any chance for the Republican Party to go back to the pre-Trump party. No, it's gone. And there's a new name for most of the people who would want to go back to that party. Paid CNN or MSNBC contributors with an R next to their name, or Democrats. That party, it's left the station. So the one caveat I would make to the first narrative is that I don't think Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz or another Republican senator, particularly someone from an Ivy League background, is likely to claim that populist mantle with nearly the effectiveness that Trump did. I think it's much more likely to be someone with the last name Trump, whether it is a comeback or whether it is one of the children.
Oh, yeah. I see.
Because the Republican Party is now stamped with that brand.
So you're saying both narratives seem to be, it's very hard to say basically at this point.
No, I would say that I would agree more with the first narrative with the caveat that
I see
that the Trump brand has become so dominant in the Republican party that I don't think has much success without some direct tie to that brand.
Awesome. I know you have to go in a couple minutes, so just two last quick questions. One is, since we were talking about, you say you look at historical trends and culture and politics. What stage do you think this country is really at right now? I mean, look at what's else going on right now. The political polarization. We see recently game stocks, stock price been driven up by people who hate the establishment, hate the elites. We see widespread distrust about expert class, and people simply don't think any of the experts know the answer anymore. So does that make things much harder to predict and forecast, much more narrative driven, and journalism also become more narrative driven? Where do you see this where we're all headed? Are you pessimistic / optimistic?
Yeah, I'm probably more on the pessimistic side of things,
Great.
watching this up
Wonderful.
close. And um, I keep going back to there was a great line in Nate Silver's "The Signal and the Noise" about how anytime throughout history there have been big advances, technological advances in the way that information is disseminated, it has the world has had a very hard time um, maintaining peace in those situations. That whenever it's become easier for charlatans to disseminate untruths, that it inevitably leads to violence. Um, I don't think the violence that we saw on January 6th has caused a course correction for the Republican Party. I think we saw in the aftermath of this election just how fragile we're hanging on to our uh, our democratic institutions by a thread. What if there were less scrupulous secretaries of state than Brad Raffensperger in states? I don't think it's possible for someone um, of Brad Raffensperger's um, uh, you know credibility or orientation to get through a Republican primary if after they have taken that stance, and that makes things very very dicey in the future. I don't see that going away. I mean, certainly deplatforming some of the loudest figures goes some of the way um, towards preventing falsehoods from taking root, but it goes a fraction of the way in my view, and there's still plenty of avenues for people to cast doubt on our democratic institutions and with bad faith.
And so to kind of wrap things up here at the podcast, we ask for our guests punchline every episode, which is basically your hot take on anything that's in your scope, whether it be electoral democracy to polling, demographic shifts, gerrymandering, I guess the upcoming midterms in a year and a half. So what's your punchline going forward as we go into an uncertain stage of our electoral democracy?
What's that? I think something that's been clear to those of us who've been covering congressional races closely the past couple of years, and all races really, is that probably the biggest security threat facing the country is the epidemic of disinformation that we're drowning in. I think that's finally become apparent the past stretch after this election. But if there's kind of one interesting um, evolution in a positive direction, it might be that politics is slightly depolarizing around race, and we saw the gap um, between non-white voters and white voters, if anything, shrink a bit between 2016 and 2020. Obviously, it was still quite wide, but I guess the punchline would be it's hazardous to predict a permanent majority or a durable trend in American politics. And so, you know, we could have a political alignment 20 years from now that we just did not see coming today. And that's what keeps this such an interesting field to be in.
Dave, thanks so much for joining you and me today. How can people follow more about your work and then get into reading more?
Well, thanks for having me. And cookpolitical.com is where I write most of my stuff. A lot of it's available for free, some of it's not, but there are monthly subscription options. And
hopefully not as expensive as it used to be when you were a kid.
Well, yeah, I guess there weren't monthly options back then, but no, I also try and write on the side for NBC News occasionally, but yeah, I really enjoy you know, the give and take on Twitter for sure, and
yes,
and I'll be sharing a lot of my maps over the course of the next year, so I look forward to provoking conversation among all of the geography nerds out there.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And if you want to follow Dave on Twitter, it's at Redistrict, Dave Wasserman. So Dave, thanks so much for joining me today. Neil, how was your first this is our second interview together. Thanks so much for joining me today as well. You can follow us on policypunchline.com and visit us on our YouTube channel, iTunes, Spotify. You can watch this video. Thanks so much for listening today.
You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.